First on the scene, crime photographer.
Got it. Look for it in the Morning Express.
Hello everyone, welcome to our presentation about Casey, Crime Photographer. This has long been one of my favorite programs. In fact, it's one of the first programs that I ventured away from the ones everybody knows, like The Shadow and The Lone Ranger and Fibber McGee and all that, to find something that I hadn't heard on a rebroadcast in the 1970s. I find it to be a very, very interesting and compelling program, very often misunderstood, and I'm hoping that we can alleviate or dispel some of those misunderstandings sometime today. A couple of housekeeping things that we need to deal with. The first thing is, if you want more information on this program and some of the resources that I have here, send an email to suspenseotr@gmail.com. and you will get a bounce back email that has lots of links to other resources. Or you can visit the Ethelbert's Archives webpage that I have set up, and the addresses are there on the screen. The easy one to remember is tinyurl.com/Ethelbert, capital M, capital A, capital N, capital C, Ethelbert MANC. If you want a lot of information about all the formats that Casey appeared over the decades, the book by Randy Cox and Dave Siegel. Dave Siegel is a very close OTR friend to many of us. He passed away a few years ago. The book was published in 2005 and covers Casey starting with the original pulp stories by George Harmon Cox and then follows it through movies, radio, and television. Dave was one of the few people to actually see a Casey television program. They are not around. They're at a Museum of Broadcasting, and he very clearly in the book states it wasn't worth it. But it is interesting to read about that particular part of the series. We're not going to cover any of that, so the book is still quite good. The research that I've been doing is built on much of the resource materials that Dave sent me a few years ago, and I'm working from that. So the radio things are going to be updated here and elsewhere, and I'll explain where later. But the book is still very much highly recommended from Bear Manor Media, and you can also find it on Amazon, and there are lots of used copies that show up on eBay. So here's the question. Why is Casey such an interesting program? One thing I've always found interesting is who likes it and who doesn't. The critics hated Casey. Well, most of the critics were working for newspapers. They weren't really part of the listening class. So I'll call them the whining class. They can't really enjoy anything. John Crosby was one of the most highly regarded radio critics of the time in the 1940s. And he said, "It's a high-rated show for reasons I'll never understand." Well, that's because you work in the newspaper business, John, but you've got to listen to it like us folks at home. The newspaper critics thought it was unrealistic, that the plot lines were not really representative of crimes and things like that, but everybody else who was listening just wanted to have fun. They also complained that Casey never seemed to take a picture, and I just always want to say, come on, folks, lighten up. Enjoy the show, because it is all for the entertainment. The whole family tended to like this. The younger folks, mom and dad, because crime always lost, the good guys always won. The people in authority weren't necessarily the best guys, but Casey, who had a hard scrabble upbringing, you have to remember at this time of U.S. history, only about 10% of the people went to college. This is a real blue-collar program, and the fact that it enjoyed its greatest popularity after World War II, with service people coming back home and people starting their lives over again. This was a program that really connected with the public. So it may not have been the educated folks who were working at the newspapers who liked it, because we know they didn't. It was everybody else who loved it. And it was interesting, the people in authority, high status, wealthy people, and Captain Logan, the police and politicians and all that, were not always competent. But it was Casey, who grew up on the streets, who had a very hard scrabble upbringing, who helped navigate through all of these problems to find justice and also to give good advice to the world. I mean, Ann Williams, his sidekick, was college educated, and she was a new reporter, and she was hanging around with Casey, who had been in the newspaper business for a little over 10 years or so, as they go through crimes and all that, and he's giving her advice about life, not just the case, along the way. And then there's just the plain old fun of being down at the Blue Note. Casey and Ann got into trouble, and coming back to the Blue Note, while it was a dramatic device to summarize the stories again, it was also a place for a lot of comic relief, and I think people really enjoyed hearing that part of the program. Now, music fans, jazz fans, loved Herman Chittison's play, and he was the inspiration for many jazz musicians. We'll talk a little bit about that later, who would just listen to him play in the background. They didn't really care about what was going on with Casey. And Blue Note, sounds strange, struck a chord with a lot of folks, and you'll still see restaurants with that name today, but the people who have it just know the Blue Note, and they don't necessarily know where the name came from. So it really did cut deep into the good nature of people. It had very, very high ratings for the most part. For a lot of this time, it was either before or after Suspense, so CBS had a great slot on Thursdays, so it had a big audience, and it did extremely well for the time it was there. How many Casey programs exist today? Well, there's 80. There are also 80% are missing. So we've only got these recordings, of which is 76 net unique episodes. I'll explain that in a second. And we don't know where anything else is. We have samples from each era, but the most recordings that we have are from the Anchor Hocking era, where they had a very, very big budget. And the show was exceptionally well done. And we've got over 50 of those episodes. We're missing about 33 of them. So that's not too bad considering what the shape is of the others. So we've got 80 recordings. One program we have both the network and the AFRS, which is interesting for this series. We have 3 reused scripts. Alonzo Deen Cole would change the names of the scripts and change the name of the characters, so it's not always obvious when they are repeats. The Upholsterer was done under the same name twice a year apart. And in the Philip Morris period, we only have 2 programs with the Philip Morris ads. The rest of those are from AFRS recordings. There's other recordings floating around, one of which is a presentation to the Anchor Hocking sales staff, and another is auditions to replace Leslie Woods, who played Ann Williams for a while. And we'll talk about our Ann Williams actresses coming up very, very soon. So this is what we have. It hasn't changed a whole lot. We seem to find a program, usually an AFRS recording, about once every 5 or 7 years. So basically have what we're going to have. You may think, oh gosh, I'll listen to all of them, but many of these recordings are worth listening to multiple times because there's many things hidden in them, and I'll try to reveal some of those aspects of them today. One of the more interesting parts of the history is that for a little while, Frank Lovejoy was going to be Casey. Frank was early in his career, but he was a very well-known New York radio actor and also active in theater. So he had a good reputation, and he was signed on in June. And then he had the opportunity to work on a play that would appear on Broadway, and he could spend the summer in Cape Cod, where it was a lot cooler. There's no air conditioning then, for the most part. And could do it with his wife, Joan Banks. They acted together very, very often, both on radio and on the stage. They picked a script called The Snark Was a Boojum, which goes back to Lewis Carroll. It did finally get to Broadway. There's a notice here from Boston where it was in some previews, and then it got to Broadway and closed after 5 performances. It was interesting reading one of the critiques of it, whereas that the play went nowhere fast in all directions. So who did they get to replace Frank Lovejoy, who never got before the microphone? They got Matt Crowley and Pesey Conklin. One thing that's quite interesting is that in the press release for the program beginning, they don't even mention the cast's names, just that the program was going to begin. Now, this implies a couple of things. First, that at the time of the press release, which would have been about 14 to 21 days before the actual broadcast date when they would send that out, the series had not been cast, or if it had been cast, these positions in the cast were just placeholders until they found someone they felt they could be confident in for the longer duration. It was the summer, so a lot of acting positions were off for the summer, so it would be easier for them to get cast members for individual episodes if they didn't leave New York City. And so they got Matt Crowley, who was a veteran, had a long career, but he's not particularly associated with one standout evening role, primetime. He was around in movies and television and radio. Pesey Conklin had a long career, nothing really notable or high profile. So they did it for 3 weeks, and then Jim Backus and Joan Allison, who went through a lot of her career with people trying to change her name to June or to Joan. She was about 21 years old in this part. She was one of the youngest and most successful radio actors at that age. And they only lasted 4 weeks before Stotts Cotsworth was hired. Now, they must have thought that Jim Backus was going to hold on to the role because they invested a lot in publicity photos. This is just one of them. But if you go on the Getty Images site and put in the search terms Jim Backus, Casey, or a flash gun Casey, you'll see a lot of at that time, very expensive photos done professionally for him. But they moved to Stotts Cotsworth, and that was an excellent situation. Stotts had established a career on both the theater and radio. He was doing them at the same time. Somehow had enough wherewithal to hold on to his role in a serial called Front Page Farrell, which is about a newspaper man, and also do theater work at this time. He was highly respected among the AFRA members. AFRA was the union for radio actors, and he had a very leading role in that, and also was respected in the theater. And I get the sense that he helped coordinate getting particular actors to appear on Casey. He had an extraordinary career. Not many people know him, especially going through the television era, but he was on many soap operas and the like, and always had a great love for theater. It's interesting when you find information about him at a young part of his career. He's described as being an artist, and that's what he went to school for, not as an actor. And through the years, he became a skilled photographer, and so he had a lot in common with this particular role. So he's an exceptional actor. You hear him on lots and lots of New York programs. In the 1950s, you'll hear him on some of the NBC shows like X-1. Then we get to Ann Williams. Now, there were 5 different Ann Williams. The person who played Ann Williams the most was Jan Miner, and she did it for 253 episodes. Leslie Woods, who is my favorite Ann Williams, had it for a little over a year, 73 episodes. You can hear her a lot on Inner Sanctum. Betty Furness had a beginnings of a good acting career both in Hollywood and New York. I remember her as a consumer reporter in the 1970s for WNBC television. Alice Reinhart was a big star, especially for a soap opera called Life Can Be Beautiful. She had it when it was a Casey press photographer, and Jackson Beck was at that time Lieutenant Logan in the series. And then Joan Allison had it for a part that overlapped with Jim Backus and with Stotts Cotsworth, but it was less than a year for her. But Jan Miner is the one who did it most often. Many people remember her for doing the Palmolive dishwashing liquid commercials. 2 other actors were very important for the series. John Gibson played Ethelbert. He did it right from the beginning, all the way through, and even got a couple of or parts of the year of the television program. He was there when Richard Carlisle had the role. He was an extraordinarily successful actor. Some of us can see him on The Honeymooners, so he was getting bit parts like that. He was very successful, and rarely in the lead of anything. But people knew that he was a very dependable actor. Some people find it amusing that he was in Speed Gibson of the International Secret Police. So he goes back a long way. Bernard Lenrow never got credited on air except in one circumstance for a episode called Busman's Holiday, where they rewrote it so that Captain Logan would be the lead character because Stotts Cotsworth was sick. But he was Jeffrey Barnes on Mole Mystery Theater. So Lenro didn't get on-air credit for Captain Logan, but his name would be in the press releases and the like. So he wasn't considered to be the top part of the cast. Cotsworth, either Woods or Minor, and Gibson would always be the ones mentioned on the programs. But when he did that basically a favor for Busman's Holiday, he got on-air credit. They just couldn't avoid it. And then the other folks, in terms of the music was very important to this show. Archie Blyer had a very brassy sound, almost like not a marching band, but I think you know what I mean. Cy Foyer was a Broadway and movie conductor and composer, so he has much smoother, much richer sense of music. That started with the Philip Morris part of the series. Herman Chittison, what a stroke of genius that was, having him be in the program. He was very close friends with George Harmon Cox. Cox was a very, very big jazz fan. One day they were talking about Flash Gun Casey coming onto the air, and Cox put in the good word that he would do it. Chittison never had a speaking role. A lot of that was union contract issues. But he was there from the beginning, not always credited, and he set the tone, literally, for the entire Casey series. And when it came time for the revival series, he wasn't available, but Teddy Wilson, also a very famous jazz pianist, came into the program at that particular time. Chittison had fans who would listen in just for the music. One of them was a famous jazz pianist, Thelonious Monk, and he and others would just tune into Casey to hear Herman play. Now, Herman had his own show on CBS. It was a 15-minute program of just music. So he was well known to the audience and the New York jazz scene. He had a very wonderful career playing in Europe. There was a great affection for American jazz there, and he was in Europe much of the time, except, of course, when he was doing the Casey show. So it was early in his career and that he came back to New York from Europe. He became very close friends with George Harmon Cox, and that's how he got onto the show. The writer of the series was mainly Alonzo Deen Cole. He's not often recognized as a radio pioneer, but he was. The program Witch's Tale was one of the few very successful radio dramas of the early 1930s, went for many years and was syndicated, and he was involved in everything. He even acted on the program. So he was writing and producing and directing and managing the syndication of the program. So he was very important at that time. Witch's Tale fell from the scene, and he was doing some various radio writing, and they came to him when the first weeks of Casey were not going well. So he was hired to fix it, and he made a lot of changes, but not all at once. But gradually you get this sense, a little more humor creeping into the series. He had a very interesting life just from a public perspective. In this particular case, there was a complaint against him chasing Mrs. Cole around the house with the gun, and she complained to the police, and then he was released. He did not have to pay a fine or serve any time. It was just dismissed. What I find the story to be so interesting, which was from the Daily News of February 26, 1949, is how lightly they treated this particular violation. That's the situation that was at that particular time, and they kind of were having fun with the idea that the writer of Flash Gun Casey could get picked up on a gun charge. He would put a lot of little bits of information into his programs. He grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, and there's one episode, there's part of the city where Casey takes place called Frogtown. Well, that Frogtown was the part of this St. Paul in Minnesota that he grew up in. So there's lots of little things like that in there. And some of the plots involve the occult or seances and things like that. And he had read up on all these things from the Witch's Tale. So he would draw on that as content for the episodes. One thing that most people did not realize, and in fact Dave Siegel never really addressed this, because I don't think he realized it at that time either when he was writing the book with Randy Cox, was that Cole was reusing incredible amounts of his scripts. It got to the point where the Philip Morris series comes along, and less than half of those scripts are new. And it may even be a smaller number than that, because he was always mixing plot lines to make new scripts, and I'll have an example coming up on a slide soon. A sad part of the story is that he had a tremendous difficulty adjusting to life after radio ended for him. He still held on to The Witch's Tale, and there were many proposals, and he sold the rights many times, and they all expired before anybody did anything with the programs. So it was disappointing. He submitted scripts for television programs, and none of them were taken. His health suffered greatly during that time in the 50s and the 1960s. It seems pretty clear he suffered from some kind of depression because one time there was a suicide attempt that was covered in the papers. It's disappointing in this regard that he could not make that transition when basically everybody else in the casts of Casey did. So he was really the only one, yet he's the one who saved the program from obscurity at the time that he came on board. We have some sponsors of the program who had a very big effect on the success of it, and that first one was Anchor Hocking.
The Anchor Hocking Glass Corporation brings you Crime Photographer.
And you don't think of this as being a good sponsor for something like Casey Crime Photographer, but there was essentially a family show, and because everyone eats and everybody has to figure out what kind of gift to get for mom for Mother's Day or what to get for a bride or a housewarming, it wasn't that bad a choice. They sponsored the program for almost 2 years. It had its best budget for everything. The orchestra, the actors, the effects, everything was just terrific. And the show would never be as good as it was in the Anchor Hocking period. One of the signature parts of this era is Toni Marvin when he starts the program. And there's a little scene at the Blue Note. Toni Marvin had worked on another Anchor Hocking program called Hobby Lobby, and they kept him over as part of their sponsorship. So I think they were looking for some kind of continuity in the sound of the program by having Toni Marvin. He would later work with Arthur Godfrey and do a lot of other radio announcing programs. But he was at his peak in terms of the golden age when he was doing Casey Crime Photographer. The most improbable sponsor was Toni Home Permanence. They followed Anchor Hocking, who felt that they weren't getting enough of a sales bump for the amount of money they were spending on Casey. So Toni decided to come in.
The way that gives that natural look is T-O-N-I, Toni.
Toni. Toni Home Permanence, the wave that gives that natural look, brings you Crime Photographer.
This was bound to be a failure because where Anchor Hocking may have seemed like it was being marketed to women, but had ripple effects all the way through daily life in the home, this was a personal care product and really didn't have any secondary appeal to anyone else in the audience. And then the people at Toni wanted things toned down. I mean, there was a lot of pressure for radio programs to be less violent. So they did that here, and they basically covered up any violence or always reported about it in the past tense. So it was not the same program. And only 5 programs exist from this part of the series. One of them is very good. The others are so-so, and one of them is kind of awful. So that's the picture that we have of Toni. One interesting thing here is that the advertising executive who was responsible for this was a man named Don Nathanson, who was a one-hit wonder scriptwriter for suspense. He wrote a script called A Guy Gets Lonely. But then he became a very big advertising agency executive, and then he got into television and cable TV and became an extraordinarily wealthy cable broadcasting executive. And I suspect he did not put the decision to sponsor Casey when he was at the ad agency for Toni on his resume. Philip Morris brought Casey back to the original style of the program.
Philip Morris presents Crime Photographer.
have the lush budget that it had under Anchor Hocking, but the program was better. Philip Morris was spending a lot of money on Philip Morris Playhouse. For that year, it was being produced by William Spear, and if you look at the programs there aren't many recordings from this particular version of Philip Morris Playhouse. They used a lot of suspense scripts or scripts like suspense. So Philip Morris was looking for something else. They thought that they would want to have a detective series with Van Heflin, and it was being rumored for months and months, and I think what happened is Heflin got very busy in movies and it never went into production, so they settled for Casey. In effect, Casey was canceled when the Toni contract ended, but CBS kept pushing Casey. They thought it was a good program, and it did decently for Philip Morris. But by the time Philip Morris got it, money was already starting to shift over to television, as were viewers. 1948 was a pivotal year for the adoption of television, and it just kept growing and growing from there. I guess that they saved some money on scripts because over half of them were reused. Cole wrote about what he knew, and he lived in Mount Vernon, which is just north of the Bronx of New York City. And not far from him was something called the Parkway Casino, which was a bar and a restaurant and an events location. And it was supposedly started by Dutch Schultz, and some of Dutch and the guys would meet there. It would be a regular stop for Franklin Roosevelt going from New York City back up to Hyde Park or up to Albany when he was governor of New York State. So it was common for people to go to this location for a meal or for an event. Right now, the building is still there. It is mainly doctors' offices, so it no longer has the bar and things like that. But as I listened to the program growing up in this area, I said, I know what that is. That's Parkway Casino. That's all it can be, because I knew where Cole was living. Also in Mount Vernon, when you listen to the program Lady Killer, there's a character, Cecil Gramadon, and there's a Gramadon Avenue a little over a mile away from the apartment building where Cole was living. There's little things like that throughout the show. One program I wish was in circulation was something called You Are the Killer, and here Cole used a real-life event as the plan for the script. Someone went into a Catholic church and shot into a confessional and shot a priest in the leg. He was trying to kill him, but he obviously missed. And when the police came to say who was the killer, there was a real-life crime photographer, Pat Candido, who was very well known in the trade and especially New York City. And somebody pointed at him and said, he's the one who did it. Now, everybody knew that Pat Candido couldn't have been the person who did it, but he was so close in resemblance, according to this witness, that there's no way that he was innocent of it. So what the police decided to do was to circulate Pat Candido's picture in the neighborhood, and eventually they found the person who was the shooter. When Cole adapted this, the original story was the priest hearing confessions. The shooter had mental problems. He was committed to a psychiatric hospital, and he was not sentenced. Cole changed the story because you can't make the story too much like real life. Otherwise, you might leave yourself open to lawsuits and similar things. So he changed the priest to a judge. The judge is shot at a party. It turns out to be a very calculated crime. And that's where it goes there, and the person is convicted in court. But there were elements of the story that mirrored the Pat Candido real-life situation. And it would be really great if this program could show up. The circus came to town. The circus was always coming into New York City. And it really seems that there's no accident that King of the Apes, which is the show that aired in the beginning of May 1947, took place at a circus.
Mid-afternoon, the Blue Note Cafe. Leaning comfortably on the bar are Casey and Ann Williams. And behind the bar, it's Chief Custodian Ethelbert.
You and Miss Williams are going to the circus tonight, huh, Casey?
Yeah, we gotta go, pal. It's an assignment.
Every year, Ethelbert, he's found an excuse to go to the circus.
You think I like to go to the circus, honey?
Well, if you don't, you'd better reserve yourself a chair in the old men's home.
She's right, Casey. Any guy who can't enjoy the circus is slipping.
Cole was always building local events around ideas for scripts, and this was a case where he did that. In this situation, it was a man in an ape suit who would imitate an ape, and if you know the King of the Apes story, the ape is a murderer, but it's not anybody imitating an ape. It's an actual ape who did that. Gentle Strangler was in the Casey comic. I'll have more information about Casey comics coming up. And this story is okay, but it uses some of the common tools that Cole would pull out of his magic bag to write his stories. Unsolved serial crimes, he loved that one, where no one can find the killer, and of course you know Casey will. Person has some kind of quirky behavior or some kind of disfigurement and is planning to get revenge on the people who turned them that way. Somehow this person gets into Casey's office, the bar, where Casey is, Casey's apartment. In this case, it's the apartment. Person is on the loose. The police want to protect Casey. Casey says no, so that happens often. And then the confrontation in the apartment where Casey, in the case of the radio program, subdues them and then calls the police. In the comic book, Casey throws the perpetrator out the window, and the Gentle Strangler, who chokes people, right, ends up getting caught on a tree and is strangled himself off the tree. For the most part, the comic books follow the original scripts, but there are little changes here and there's some continuity issues that we'll identify soon. He used this story again to create Thunderbolt, but he made so many changes it wasn't a wholesale repeat of the program. Stotts Cotsworth did not like studio audiences, and that was a hallmark of the Anchor Hocking series. He referred to it as an unnecessary evil, that the studio audience could spoil the performance by coughing or anything else, and he really didn't like Bobby Soxers. This New York Times piece, he comes off as kind of a little bit of an elitist, but I understand the problem. He says the impassive face of some Bobby Soxer framed against a constantly growing balloon. All right, so bubblegum was in use in the audience, and those kinds of things really annoyed the actors. He didn't publish this opinion piece until after the Anchor Hocking contract ended, but I assume he made his ideas known to them, just not publicly. And the reason I bring this up is that there's a program, Queen of the Amazons, which is a repeat program, and it starred as the guest Hope Emerson, who was a former circus strongwoman. She was 6'2", 230 pounds. When she was on stage for this program, because this program featured a strong woman, right, somebody who worked at a circus, she would be the tallest person on stage. It had to make the performance more credible for the audience. And John Dietz, who was the director, probably wanted to get a rise out of the audience by having her, but he probably wanted to prevent having some small stature actress, someone who's like 5'1", doing the part of a circus strongwoman. So having Hope Emerson solved two problems there. You actually got somebody who the audience would have a proper reaction to, and you prevented a problem later. For those who remember the Peter Gunn series, she was in the first season, played Mother, and the reason she was not in any of those was that she unfortunately passed away during the program. Curious episode is something called Unlucky Numbers, and it's actually a reworked Big Story script. And this is a chart that shows the comparison between the Big Story episode and the actual Casey program. The dialogue is essentially the same for a great portion of the program. It's just that the names have changed. This script was written by Gail Ingram, who was a writer for the Big Story, and her husband Harry Ingram was also a radio writer, and together they would produce and direct programs as well as write them. One of them was Tales of Fatima with Basil Rathbone. And she wrote the Big Story script. Harry adapted it for Casey, and that's how it got reused. It's a good show, and it's interesting to listen to the two of them or read the Big Story script while the Casey program is playing. Continuity is an issue for many of these programs, and we're always trying to figure out, where does Casey take place? The pulp took place in Boston. And so you have a choice of Boston and New York. Alonzo Deen Cole is in New York. So you have some tension in the series, as there are references made to various aspects of these cities. By the end of this series, Cole was writing about New York. The Christmas shopping episode has some references to Boston, especially a relationship that the city has with Nova Scotia. Some events occur in various stories. Duke of Skid Row, I give the example of getting the same cab driver. You can do that in a smaller city. At that time, Boston was a much smaller city than New York. In the episode Sellout, which is a Philip Morris episode, it takes place in Maine, and as they go through the dialogue, Maine's not that far away. It does make sense that you'd vote for Boston in that case. But then in New York, so many things happen in New York. There's an episode where snowfall is mentioned, and snowfall happened in New York. So it's usually something like that. And then, what did Cole have in mind for the Morning Express? Well, the way they describe it through the series, you eventually piece it together. It's not the New York Times. It is the New York Daily News. It is the blue-collar newspaper of the city, which had an emphasis on being New York's picture newspaper. So right from the beginning, you knew that they were interested in photographs. The other thing that's not consistent is, what does Anne look like? There's a running joke about blondes, and here are some clips that indicate that.
Blondes. Wow.
Right now, all I want is a blonde.
Yeah, that's all most men want, Logan.
Oh, I don't know what there is about blondes, real or phony, but they sure appeal to men.
So it is very funny that Anne does not like all this talk about blondes, because she's not a blonde. But then when it comes time to do the comic book, she is. The Casey character was not really being managed very well. Cox obviously created it, but the people who were in charge of it were essentially doing anything that they wanted. There were changes made in the 1950s television program that were much different than the radio program. Now, as far as the comic book goes, there are some programs that are not in circulation, but we can read the comic book to get a sense of what it was like. So this little chart does that. The comic book only lasted 4 episodes. It was replaced by a Western comic book. Some of the titles are different. The Gentle Strangler became Face to Face with the Strangler. But there are episodes like The Girl on the Dock, which is in issue number 1, In the Sweet Name of Charity, which is in issue number 2, and Glowing Ghost, which is in issue number 3. Now, I haven't found if the scripts in the 4th issue are tied to any particular broadcasts yet, but I'm still working on that. That does take a lot of work because we don't have the scripts of the programs to help us, so we have to kind of back into it with other kinds of research. We're coming down to the close here, so if you want to listen to Casey, what are the best ones to listen to? And you've got 8 of them right here. Christmas Shopping has a nice interchange between Casey and Anne. Sets the tone for a lot of the series on how they're going to get along, especially in the new era of anchor hocking, where they have bigger budgets and things like that. A backstory is Ethelbert's attempt to get a Christmas tree, which is very funny. The 20-Minute Alibi is written by a big story writer. Some of these episodes are not Alonzo Deen Cole stories. Demon Minor was a script that Cole submitted for The Shadow, called Knocker on Tolliver Level. It was rejected by Blue Coal because Blue Coal didn't like the idea of having a murder in a coal mine. And that is the last time Leslie Woods, whom I still believe is the best Ann Williams, that's the recording, that's her last performance. I believe that she did it for 1 more week, from the best I can tell from the newspapers. I like the story Laughing Killer a lot. There's a continuing theme that Casey is always helping people down on their luck. And he does that in this case. Cole uses an exploding gun to solve the case. He uses that in other episodes. It's one of his favorite things. Miscarriage of Justice is a complex story. The more complex Cole stories are, generally the better. The more they have to explain in the Blue Note Cafe at the end of the story, generally the story is better. This is one of those. Camera Bug has, if you've seen the movie called Northside 77, you know how that goes, where they use a photograph to solve the case. And this is one of the cases where Casey's photograph actually plays into the story. Too Many Angels is also a non-Cole script. Ethelbert has gotten roped into a Broadway play. He didn't have to put up a lot of money. He just wanted to rub shoulders with people who fund Broadway plays. And so he did, and the story turns out to be pretty good. Earned Reward is a original George Harmon Cox story. Finally gets presented here on the radio program with appropriate adaptations. There are some special episodes. Two of them are Santa Claus of Bums Boulevard. A lot of OTR fans make it a point to listen to this one with their families. It has a lot of biblical references in it. I don't know how strong Cole's religious nature was, but he did know his Bible. So you'll find some of those in there, and I've got something written about the particular references of things he mentions in there. They're kind of basic, but a lot of people don't know where they come from. Scene of the Crime is a Harry Ingram script, and he must have been very familiar with the whole Casey franchise because he does a terrific job in this. Ethelbert is the center of attention here because he takes a home study course. He wants to be a detective, and there's some funny dialogue where he explains why he didn't take a home photography course, where he's explaining all that to Casey. It's a good show, but if you've never listened to Casey before, you won't get a lot of the sentiments expressed in it about Ethelbert's personality and the like. So listen to the others first. Avoid at all costs, and do not ever have a friend listen to this program and say, oh, gee, you'll like Casey Crime Photographer. Here's Mysterious Lodger. Do not do that. Mysterious Lodger and Woman of Mystery are the same program. They've changed some of the names. There is a little historical thing in here that's interesting. Eva Condon, who was a Broadway actress for 40-something years. She's in the program. She may have been a friend with Stotts Cotsworth. They needed a script for Halloween. Cole pulled out a Witch's Tale script and changed it to Great Grandfather's Rent Receipt and Witch's Tale. They did it twice. It was Procrastinating Willie's Rent Receipt. And they just added some Blue Note conversation claiming that it's about Casey's grandfather. I think it's an awful episode. There are some people who like it. There's no explaining taste. Action Photograph is a good script that could have been, but it got so toned down and so distorted with the guidelines for Toni that it's a bad script. I haven't found anything that indicates Cole used the ideas in a different script. And then Thunderbolt is just an awful program. It reworked from The Gentle Strangler. Those are my recommendations, and I'd just like to put in a plug for something I'm working on, which has a lot more detail than we've gone through here. I'm finishing up a book on the series. It should be out in November through Amazon, just in time for Christmas, when you're listening to Santa Claus of Bums Boulevard, I guess. I go through all 80 programs, get all the cultural references. That's one of the things that's concerned me. Casey is full of cultural references at the time that a lot of people don't know them anymore. So I dig into those, what they are, so you can appreciate the program a lot better. Also, the series log is much more improved, much more detailed than was in the Siegel and Cox book. And we identified the repeats and various curiosities for that, and a lot of other behind-the-scenes production insights. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Again, send an email to suspenseotr@gmail.com, and you'll get a bounce back, a lot of links to interesting things about this series. Thank you very much, and hopefully in 2021 we can be at the convention in person.